Welcome back, artists. I'm Waiya Paints, and today I'm delving into the edgier side of comics. You see, the sculptors over at OpiumClay Studios noticed the lack of one of the most iconic comic book characters of the 90s, Spawn. So, after a bit of email tag, they shot me over their STL and became this week's sponsor. Looking at the file, it's got everything a good Spawn model needs. Spikes, whippy chains, and about 60% cape. And I thought, what better way to handle Mr. Simmons than a comic book cel-shaded art style? One of the benefits of choosing this style is most of the work is front-loaded in our color choice. After that, it's pretty smooth sailing. So come meet me at the painting table. I'm gonna grab my brushes. Let's get started. Typically, I don't film all of the prep and sanding, but this gives me a good opportunity to talk about the style for a second, so please bear with me. The 2.5D cel shading flat comic book style strives to mimic a two-dimensional art style in a three-dimensional medium. It has a very low skill floor to get in the style, but an incredibly high skill ceiling. Hopefully by the end of this video, you'll feel confident enough to try it out for yourself. One of the perks of this style is not needing any smooth blends, but the trade-off is requiring a strong understanding of light and how it interacts with shapes. As I mentioned earlier, color choice is going to play a big role here, as our palette will be severely restricted. Using this as my color reference, you can notice that each main component, ignoring the cape, is simplified to a light color, shade color, and black. So before I paint anything, I want to nail down my color choices now. And since I'll need black for inking, his suit will have to be a cool or neutral dark gray. And for the accent white, you want to avoid using white, so a couple of light neutral grays should be best. And before I leave the sanding step, I needed to address his cape, and seeing as it's 70% of any depiction of Spawn, it needed to look its best. So any seams had to go. The first thing I do is handle any support marks. And while I usually angle parts to have this on glued surfaces, with billowing capes, it's kind of unavoidable. Just be sure to fill any divots before you start sanding. It's a lot easier to sand a hill flat than it is to smooth out a sharp valley. Once the surfaces look good, I glued them up with a focus on the outside seam, as it will be the most visible one. The important thing here is to make sure that the major surface elements are lined up. In this case, the waves in the fabric. There's no method I know that can correct a misaligned connection. Comparatively, the width of the gap and the step downs on the side are a piece of cake to fix. All you need is some resin in a blacked out dropper bottle with a syringe, a hand operated UV light, and gloves. Don't forget gloves. I started with a thin bead of resin just to bridge the gap, followed by a 1-minute cure. This first pass won't completely fill it, so don't even try. You want multiple thin layers that build up to fill it in. By my second and third pass, it was looking mostly fill, but I still had a slight dip, and for best results, you want to slightly overfill, so I gave it one more go. But be careful, as at this point it's very easy to overfill and have it start dripping. Keeping a paper towel handy will be helpful. The warped edges got a little extra love as well. Then I flipped it over to seal up the other side. But since this side will be well hidden, I didn't spend too much time on it to try to get it perfect. After a full 5-minute cure, the cape was looking ready for some sanding. When it comes to sanding grits when working with resin, 120 to 220 are going to be your workhorses. 120 eats away the material very fast, while 220 will give you a good finish for most applications. For the actual sanding of the seam, I tend to take it fold by fold as I sand down the excess resin flush with the seam. What I'm looking for is the added resin puddle to thin down to just the seam. That's when I know I'm flush. And then I keep on going fold by fold until I reach the other end. And while the inside did get attention, again, this is a very well hidden negative space that's incredibly hard to work on. So I didn't spend forever on it. New rule, no looking up skirts or capes from now on. Once I was happy with the seam, I went back over all the sanding with a 220 grit. This will buff out any scratches left by previous sanding and leaves the surface pretty darn close to fresh printed resin. To check on my work, I primed the surface. I had sanded out a detail or two, but it looked good to go. Time to paint. Starting with a quick prime in black, because Spawn. That was pretty painless. Now, to start painting proper with the base. It's a pretty straightforward weathered pillar with gargoyles. The combination of classic and brutal industrial architecture style really fits the Spawn neo-Gothic look, but I wanted to add a subtle contrast between the two combined styles. So while they'll both be gray, I went with the slightly warm dark stone for the pillar itself. Just a quick all-over base coat will do just fine. For the highlight tone, I mixed in some spaceship exterior. Now, before we add this highlight, we need to decide where it's going to go. Thankfully, to start, we have a really simple shape. So I'm going to restrict this highlight to the panels that are mostly faced upwards. And don't worry, having a hardline transition is one of the hallmarks of this style, but it does need to be clean and crisp. So as it goes on, it'll look a little chunky, but you'll have to trust the process. This is a style that doesn't come together until the last few details. With everything dried, it's time to talk about blacklining. Now, if you don't have a steady hand, you can try these paint markers. With a felt tip, it makes it super easy to follow the valleys, and it's much sturdier than a paintbrush, so it gives you a bit of a safety net when it comes to using too much pressure. The one downside to using these markers is being locked into that tip width. So while it did a pretty good job getting the edges done pretty fast, on the top where I'd like to have finer details, I was left stuck with a pretty chunky look, almost like an oversized MS Paint tool. So for finer areas, it's probably best to stick with a brush. As for placement, I stuck to blacklining all the external edges and then added some dots and stipples into the worn areas. With everything dry, the base was coming together. It just needed those decorative gargoyles. I chose to keep these simple as to not draw too much attention from Albert, so each got a rough base of mountain stone. They were then finished off with a scruffy dry brush of uniform gray. With the base all finished up, I figured this is a great time to take a moment to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. Your monthly support is inching me closer and closer to that new Fanatic paint set, for which I can't thank you enough. If you would like to join the Painting Pantheon, you can find a link in the description below. You can even join for free and get insight on my future projects. And people have messaged me, "Hey Waiya, you should see if Army Painter wants to sponsor you and they could send you some free paint." Don't worry, I've asked. A lot. And they've said no. A lot. But the nice people over at OpiumClay said yes. This is my first time working on one of their models, and I gotta say, I like it. If you'd like to get your hands on Spawn or any of their other STLs, be sure to check out their link to their Patreon in the description below. For now, Mr. Simmons is getting very impatient for his vengeance. Let's get back to it. Looking at Spawn's suit, there are going to be three major components: the dark undersuit, the light accents, and the red straps. I want to handle them all together in two stages, starting with the shade colors. For the undersuit, the mountain stone works as my deepest gray. It might look a little light, but we need that floor space for blacklining to do its job. So, resisting the urge to darken it, I push forward with this shade, as any touch-ups are infinitely easier when I don't have to remix a custom color. A solid opaque all-over base coat got the job done. For the light gray accent, ash gray. Here's the first clean painting section of this project. Thankfully, they're mostly straight lines, but you really want to make sure you have a crisp edge. And a properly thin paint will require you to do multiple passes, so try to accept this is just gonna take some time. A common shortcut people try to use is taking thick, unthinned paint in an attempt to get full coverage in one go. And while you will get that coverage, you're gonna quickly gunk up the details and it won't look good. We're saving a lot of time in other areas, so it's only logical that we spend that time where we have to. For the dark red, terracotta. Just thin it down and spread it out. The only extra wrinkle here is the spikes that you'll have to paint around. This is the reason for the small brush. Using a floofy brush over spikes like this can result in lots of bubbles in your paint, which is a no bueno. With all the base shadow tones down, it was time for the highlights, starting with Dungeon Gray. Before you start placing highlights, it's a good idea to hold the model in place and visualize how the light hits each part. So for this leg, I want it to hit the top part of the thigh and across the kneecap, along with a line down the tibia, then the top caps of the calves. And I want strong, full opacity highlights, edge to edge, so everything will need at least a second coat, so be prepared. For the hips, be sure to give Spawn a little junk in the trunk. Having the highlights swoop down a bit can do that for you. And don't forget to do the top side of the other leg as well. It's angled up enough to warrant a full highlight. For the chest, it's going to get a bit more complicated as you're going to be dealing with a lot more elevation changes. I started with the easy highlight of the pectoral and then started moving out. I had to keep reminding myself not to try to blend it and to leave it chunky. Trust that process and push forward. Give each ab the dabs they need and get the tops of the arms brightened up. And while I am using the head as a handhold, it's important not to forget to add a highlight to the crown. On the arms, again, it's a good idea to hold them in place to see how the highlights need to line up to stay consistent with the chest. To highlight the bright accents, spaceship exterior. Here I'm trying to take a mental picture of where the light falls off the shadow parts and then just painting within those lines. The hardest part here is making sure your shadow line is even on each side, but thankfully cleanups, if needed, will be fairly easy. Also, can't forget to highlight the mask. To highlight the red, vermilion. Now, highlights here need to be a bit more deliberate, and for the boot, there needs to be some consideration for the shadow that the body casts on it. But outside of that, highlighting the top half of each strap should do the job. Time for black lighting with black. If you're feeling confident, try to do this with a brush. With a bit of practice, you can get much thinner lines that you can ever get with a pen. Just make sure you use the right brush. This is a liner brush that you would find in most brush sets. The long and narrow belly design not only gives you a consistent flow rate on your paint, but also with a bit of practice, you can effortlessly have it trace the groove on a surface. I would start with the sharpest and most well-defined grooves, like on this W. The idea is to use the last 20% of the brush like a stylus. With a light pressure, the brush will settle into the detail, and then you just drag it along the path. Be sure not to overload the brush, and you will get a nice, thin, crisp line. Then, once you're feeling a bit more brave, you can move on to the lines for each ab, separating the top of each muscle from the one above. Then, once you're in the groove, move out to the lats, just following the sculpted valleys. If you get a bit too nervous, it's okay to pump the brakes and stop. This can be one of those less is more techniques when you're first starting, as overdoing it with black lining can happen very fast. Just be sure to ask yourself, does it need more before you add more? Then, learn by doing. Continuing this across his body is pretty straightforward of blacklining the straps as needed until it got to the legs. Here you're going to need to take extra time to add more surface shadows to shape the muscles. Thankfully, you can follow the sculpted lines for the most part. Just don't use them all or it'll start to look a little too busy. After all that, I blacked out all the spikes to prepare for the metallics. Now with metallics, it's extra important that you thin down your paints or you're going to get a chunky finish. But if you use a black undercoat, even a very thin down quality metallic will work in about 1 or 2 coats. Now, painting spikes can be tedious, especially when you turn your piece and find an angle you miss, but it's gotta be done. So put on a decent movie and settle in. And let's not forget about his armband. For a highlight, I'm hopping up to Mithril from Fnatic. On the spikes, I'm reserving this for the upward turn surfaces. So, leg spikes got the top half treatment, while arm spikes varied based on the angle it was sitting on the arm. Again, holding it in place can help a lot when it comes to imagining where these highlights should be. And just because, I broke out my metal medium. This was just to kiss the tip of each spike. I don't know, I just think it makes it look a little bit more dangerous. And best not forget his belt buckle. I've been painting that too, just not much to say about it. It's a skull. Edge highlighting is going to be your friend. Now it's time for these whippy chains, and I'm going to handle them in a similar way to the spikes, starting with a heavy dry brush of the dark gunmetal. Whenever I paint chains, a dry brush has never let me down. It picks up all the details and retains the deepest shadows, but it's super important to rotate them in every direction so you can make sure you have even coverage everywhere. Now, you could leave it here, but we're going to step it up with a highlight. But first, I want to align each of the chains as they will sit on the model. This is just so I know what is the top side of each. Now, using a lighter Fnatic gunmetal, I dry brushed on a highlight to the top half. This will give you a subtle level 1 overhead highlight. And once again, we could leave it here and it looked great. But I have this mithril that I really want to use some more. So I picked out some areas on the chain that looked interesting to add a bit more highlighting to. It's a small extra step that really starts to elevate the piece as a whole. Next to paint are these Hellfire hand thingies. Time to incorporate some vibrant greens. I'm going to start off with this slightly bluish green elemental bolt. While not the traditional neon green of OG McFarlane, I like the slight tint of blue, and I think it helps pop a little bit more. As a highlight, I mixed in 50/50 Kraken skin. While the Sigil got a full highlighting, the fiery tips only got half coverage. I then came back with a light dry brush of pure Kraken skin as a final highlight pass. The final major part to paint is this cape, and saving it for last makes sense, as it's about 80% of this model. And as I came to find out, possibly higher, as it ran out of terracotta about halfway through. Thankfully, I had plenty of splattered crimson, and the name was a better fit to boot. A solid 2 coats was all it took for this cape to start looking the part. For the highlight, I opted for a dry brush of vermilion. This was to draw more attention to the cape with how important it is to the character, so soft transitions from light dry brushing across the waves was just what the doctor ordered. I did give all the edges a bit extra to add some definition. And the attached skulls and chains got a similar metal paint up of gunmetal then mithril. Then I glued it all up to call it done. But then I ran into 2 issues. During my dry fitting, I knew it was going to be a very tight fit to get this over his head. What I didn't realize is that you can't actually get the correct angle to get his head in if you've already glued on the arms. Big oof. I had to employ some surgical wire snips to break the front chain and glue down the cape. I kinda wish this had bigger keying tabs to secure a cape of this size, but not checking the fit with the arm was on me. Either way, this time, I really called it done. And dang, Albert, you looking good! A cell shading style really shows off McFarlane's character designs. and it saves a whole ton of time and heartache sweating over blends. I definitely have to use it more on this channel, as it was plenty fun and I can appreciate the results. But what about all of you? Is this comic 2.5 dimensional style something you're ready to take a dive in? If so, this is a good model to start with. So be sure to check out our sponsor, OpiumClay Studios, to get your hands on this and many other models. They have a Titus from 40K coming up that might see some time on the painting table. But for now, I have to get focused on next week's project if I want to get it out on time. So please like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you're new. It's the #1 way to help a small channel like ours survive and thrive. As always, thank you for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process. I gotta remember not to drink Kool-Aid when I'm filming.